That, ladies and gentlemen, is a growth rate of 6,708%. I mean, put that in your pipe and smoke it, huh? 6,708%. I don't care what industry you're in. If you've got an almost 7,000% growth rate, that ain't too bad. Okay? So that's point one. Do not be seduced by the narrative of decline, because it is not the global Catholic story. Point two, corollary number two. Let's do some basic math. As of today, September 30th, 2012, there are 1.2 billion baptized Catholics in this world of ours, and there are 67 million Catholics in the United States. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that American Catholics account for exactly 6% of the global Catholic population. 6%. Put another way, in important respects, 94% of the Catholics in the world aren't like us. And by the way, if you ever wonder why the Pope is not thinking American thoughts when he gets out of bed in the morning, you know, this might have something to do with it. Okay? It's a bigger and more complicated church out there. Bottom line, folks, is this. If it ever was adequate, and I underline if, okay, but if it ever was adequate to try to understand the Catholic Church exclusively through the prism of American interests, American experiences, and American priorities, trying to do that is certainly inadequate to the new realities of our time. It simply does not do justice to who we are today, and it won't cut it. Okay, my message is simple. In thinking about the Catholic Church in the early 21st century, we really only have two options. Okay? One, we think globally, or two, we think dysfunctionally. Sorry to tell you, those are the only two entrees on the menu. Okay? Now, let me quickly try to tease out a couple of implications for Catholic Charities from this mammoth transformation in Catholic life. First, I think the rise of a world church means that defense of and solidarity with the poor is destined to be a growth industry in Catholicism in our time. Defense of and solidarity with the poor is destined to be a growth industry. And this is not merely because by now it has become a consolidated pillar of official Catholic social teaching, although it obviously has, but increasingly because the poor are going to be our people. Okay? Let's look at the global scene. Do you know the three spots on the global map today where in percentage terms Catholicism is growing the most rapidly? This, by the way, would be a great way to win a bar bet sometime, because I don't think most people would come up with this list. Okay. In percentage terms, the most rapid growth in Catholicism, in third place is sub-Saharan Africa. In second place is the Indian subcontinent, in particular northeastern India. And in first place, and this is the one I think would really be a jaw-dropper for a lot of people, the place on the map where in percentage terms Catholicism is growing the most rapidly is the Arabian Peninsula. Okay? The Arabian Peninsula. Now, these are mostly not native Arabs, but from a Catholic population of essentially zero a generation ago, Saudi Arabia today has a Catholic population that is conservatively estimated at 1.5 million, and a lot of people think it's closer to 2. The Arabian Peninsula as a whole, you're probably talking about at least 3 million Catholics. These are mostly so-called guest workers, immigrants from places like India and the Philippines and Indonesia and Korea and Lebanon and Vietnam and other spots on the map that are taking the oil industry and domestic service jobs that Saudi Arabians don't want to do for themselves. Okay? A burgeoning Christian footprint in the very heart of the Islamic world. It's one of the most fascinating phenomena on the Catholic map today. Now think about who these people are. In a staggering number of cases, whether we are talking about Catholics who are, that is, pre-existing Catholics who are relocating or new converts to Catholicism, we're also talking about economically, socially, and culturally vulnerable and marginalized people. That's certainly true quite often in sub-Saharan Africa. It is certainly true in India, where something like 65 to 70% of new converts to Catholicism come from the Dalit and tribal underclass. And it is certainly true of this new Christian population in the Arabian Peninsula I'm talking about, where they not only face severe limits on their ability to practice the faith, but they also typically arrive poor and are exploited and discriminated against in an economic, social, and cultural sense as well. And what is true globally, ladies and gentlemen, is also true domestically. If you look at the American Catholic population, conservatively it's estimated that Hispanics now compose about 35% of the American Catholic population. Somewhere in this century, we're going to reach a tipping point where they're probably going to be a majority. And we also know that from all of the social measures we have, since many of those Hispanics are recent immigrants, they are also economically, culturally, socially at-risk populations. The Pew Forum tells us that Hispanic immigrants in the United States are 7 times less likely to have graduated college than white Americans. They are 2.5 times more likely to earn less than $30,000 a year. And they are also significantly more likely to be either underinsured or uninsured when it comes to the healthcare system. In other words, my point is that both globally and here at home, increasingly the poor are going to be our people. And so therefore, concern for the poor, defense of the poor, solidarity with the poor, and advocacy for the poor is going to be a growth industry, not merely because it's an important humanitarian imperative for all the reasons that Father Larry so eloquently expressed just before lunch, but also to the very practical pastoral concern of taking care of who the Catholic Church is today. Okay? Second implication I want to give you for Catholic Charities. In the wide galaxy of the things the Church is worried about in the early 21st century, here's a prediction I'm going to give you. I predict that the premier social and political concern of the Catholic Church in our time is going to be the defense of religious freedom. I predict that the defense of religious freedom is going to be the premier social and political concern of the Church in our time. And when I say that, I'm not talking primarily about the domestic religious freedom issues, of which the current dispute between the bishops and the White House over insurance mandates is the leading symbol. That's certainly part of the picture. But I'm talking about the much more chilling and harrowing threats to religious freedom that are afflicting Catholics and Christians in particular in a growing number of global hotspots. Let me give this to you in a soundbite, ladies and gentlemen. In the United States, a threat to your religious freedom means that you might get sued. In a number of other places in this world, it means that you might get shot. And I would hope we could all agree that rate's a little higher on the urgency meter. Huh? Look around. Here are the realities of our time. According to the International Society for Human Rights, which is a secular NGO, not a church outfit, based in Frankfurt, Germany, the estimate is that 80% of all acts of religious discrimination in the world today are directed against Christians. From a statistical point of view, Christians are actually by far, by some order of magnitude, the most persecuted religious body on the planet today. Second statistic from the Pew Forum. They estimate that Christians face some form of harassment, either de jure or de facto, in a staggering total of 173 nations. And bear in mind, the United Nations only recognizes 193 countries. Okay? And here's the most bone-chilling statistic of all. According to Aid for the Church, to the Church in Need, which is a widely respected Catholic humanitarian outfit with a global reach with headquarters in Germany, according to Aid to the Church in Need, there are 150,000 Christians each year in this world who are killed either out of hatred for the faith or hatred for the works of charity inspired by the faith. 150,000. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that in the hour we are going to be together here this afternoon, somewhere on this planet, 17 Christians are losing their lives. In the early 21st century, we are, in effect, witnessing the rise of an entire new generation of Christian martyrs. And as the voice of the Global South increasingly sets the leadership tone in the Catholic Church, the fate of those suffering Christians is increasingly going to be a front-burner concern for the Church. It will, I am convinced, become the transcendent Christian Catholic cause of our time, and that Catholic Charities, whether your mandate is domestic, international, or somewhere in between, increasingly, you will be pressed to advocate on behalf of and to devote your resources to gestures of solidarity with these suffering people. If you want the single most harrowing example of the realities I'm talking about, because I know those are all statistics, I would direct your attention to what's happened to the church in Iraq. Do you know that in 1991, at the time of the first U.S.-led Gulf War, there were an estimated 2 million Christians in Iraq? It was the second largest Christian community in the Middle East outside of the 10 million Copts in Egypt. Today, the high-end estimate for the number of Christians left is around 450,000, and most people think it's closer to 200,000. It's a church that has essentially been gutted in the arc of the last 2 decades. I recently interviewed one of the survivors at the siege of the Church of Our Lady of Salvation in Baghdad on October 31st, 2010. In itself, the fact the church that was bombed that day is no novelty. Of the 63 Christian churches in Baghdad, 40 of them have been bombed at least once since the second Gulf War began in 2003. But what followed was unusual because armed Islamic gunmen stormed the church. They shot the priest who was celebrating Mass. They shot the 2 deacons who were assisting him. They killed 33 other people, leaving 36 dead. And they held the church for 6 hours until the Iraqi army showed up to liberate it. Now, this young woman I interviewed, a Chaldean Catholic by the name of Fatima, who's now in Rome, was singing in the choir that day. Her choir mate on her right, her choir mate on her left were both shot dead. The way she survived was by falling to the floor and pulling their bodies over her and playing dead for those agonizing 6 hours it took for someone to show up and rescue her, thinking every minute that one of these guys was going to come by and deliver the coup de grace. Now, as I say, she has subsequently relocated to Rome, and she spends her every waking moment trying to help her fellow Christians get out of Iraq because she's profoundly convinced they have no future there. Now, one hopes she's wrong, of course, but it's impossible to fault the experience and the chain of reasoning that's led her to that conclusion. Those are the new realities of our time, and increasingly they're going to engage the energies of all of us to respond. All right. If our first trend concerns largely the global south, our second, and I'll try to do this briefly, is more focused on the global north. It's the rise of what I call evangelical Catholicism. And here I am obviously borrowing a term from our Protestant brothers and sisters and sort of translating it back into a Catholic context. Here's what I mean by it. When I say evangelical Catholicism, I mean the momentum in the church today, which is both palpable and ubiquitous, okay, to defend and foster a strong sense of traditional Catholic identity vis-a-vis the secular world. So at a very banal, visible level, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, I'm talking about things like priests wearing Roman collars, men and women religious wearing the habit, Eucharistic adoration and Marian devotion, all of those traditional markers of Catholic identity that to some extent went out of fashion after the Second Vatican Council, but today are quite clearly staging a comeback. Okay? But as I say, those things are really just the tip of the iceberg. What's underneath is a defining concern among church leaders today that the church be sort of inoculated against being sort of seduced by and assimilated to the very relativized and secular cultural milieu in which we live. In other words, the kind of defining concern is the church not end up, in the famous language of Jacques Maritain, the French Catholic philosopher and statesman, that the church not end up kneeling before the world, okay, worshiping at the altar of the secular world, being Catholic in name only, but really taking its worldview and its cues and its modus operandi from secular culture. Okay? Let me put this point differently. If you want to understand the policy-setting level of the church these days, that is, why decisions are being made the way they are in the Vatican or the U.S. Bishops' Conference or in a growing number of individual dioceses, this trend is easily the most important one to get your mind around, and you can see its footprints everywhere. I mean, liturgy is one classic example. This concern to foster a strong sense of Catholic identity is why Benedict XVI in 2007 issued a motu proprio authorizing wider celebration of the old Latin Mass, the so-called Tridentine Rite, because over the centuries it's been a crucible for a kind of thick sense of Catholic identity. This is why we went through an anguished 20-year debate in the English-speaking world over retranslation of the prayers for the Mass. I mean, folks, this is why when you go to your local parish for the Sunday liturgy and the celebrant says to you, "The Lord be with you," we no longer say, "and also with you." We say it with me, "and with your spirit." Huh? My point is that you're going to get that wrong if you try to see it in isolation. You have to see it as a small piece of a much vaster picture, which is this effort to awaken a strong sense of traditional Catholic distinctiveness. Okay? But I also want to tell you that you're going to get this evangelical momentum wrong if you see it exclusively as a top-down operation in the church, that is, as something being imposed from on high, because it's not. There's also a strong bottom-up component to it. And let me tell you where you can find it in its most concentrated form. Where you can find it these days is among a certain subsegment of the younger Catholic population. Okay? Now, I'm not talking about, the broad mass of 20 and 30-something-year-old Catholics who, as we all know, are all over the map in terms of faith and values and attitudes to the church and all of that. But I'm talking about that inner core of most actively committed young Catholics these days. Okay? Think about the kind of young people you'll find at a World Youth Day, who are the most likely to discern a vocation to the priesthood and religious life, the most likely to enroll in a